think we can start. If anybody else joins, I'll just let them in and they can catch up, I'm sure. But thank you for making the time to be with us this afternoon. The 8th BASIS webinar of the year, in the 8th month of the year. These webinars, if you're only recently kind of joining our webinars, they started during the pandemic. And we've carried them on because people keep turning up, and we're constantly trying to respond to the kind of challenges that you raise with us and the issues that you feel are important. So if there are things that you want to cover in future webinars, please just let us know and we will endeavour to make sure that they are covered. So as long as you continue to find them useful, we will continue to deliver them. And today we're going into one of the main topics that is repeatedly raised with us by our members and by everybody who's connected to sustainability in sport. And it's about communicating about sustainability in an effective and confident way. We hear quite a number of things from our members, and this isn't an exhaustive list at all, but kind of 5 things in summary. Number 1, we want to talk about the work that we're doing, but it's not a priority for our comms teams. Number 2, our comms teams don't feel confident communicating about sustainability. Number 3, climate change is a divisive issue in society, and we don't want to be seen as political. Number 4, we're not doing everything, so we don't want to talk about doing anything because we fear a bit of a backlash. And number 5, our fans or our players or our stakeholders only want us to talk about the sports that we are responsible for delivering. Now, that's not exhaustive. I'm sure there are other challenges that you experience, and there's plenty of time during this webinar to raise them and to talk about them. And some of those challenges are real, and some of them are closer to being a myth. And I think what we'd like to try and do as a first step with this webinar is to bust some of the myths and to start to tackle some of those challenges. And we've got a couple of brilliant guests to help us think that through. First up, we've got Dr. Chris Pollard from Climate Outreach. Chris is a senior researcher, and if you're not aware of the work that Climate Outreach does, then you're in for a bit of a treat this afternoon, because for 20 years they've been working to understand how people think and feel about climate change and how to tell climate stories that make a real difference and have a real impact. And in my view, and I'm not just saying this because Chris is here, this is why we've invited them to be part of this webinar. In my view, they've done more than any other group or organisation to transform our understanding of climate change from a story about science to a story which is fundamentally about people. Chris is going to help us to understand what people are really thinking and feeling about climate change out there in society, what your audiences or potential audiences are thinking and feeling, and how to use that insight to tell stories about climate change and sustainability to your audience in a way that moves and motivates them. And then we're going to turn to our good friend, Dave Lockwood, the head of editorial sustainability at BBC Sport. I'm sure you all know Dave, and it's always good to have him with us. And he can offer a unique insight into what broadcasters and media outlets are looking for when, we're trying to get sustainability stories related to sport into the media, so that you can go beyond your core audiences and try and get widespread media coverage for the work that you're doing. Dave's perfectly placed to kind of help us understand what journalists are looking for, how editorial decisions are made, and what you should be thinking about when you're framing your stories and picking your news lines. As usual, we've got about an hour, so we'll run till we're done with questions or when we hit 3 o'clock, whichever is sooner. Our guests are just going to speak for as long as they choose to. I'd really rather not restrict them because they've got some important messages for us. And when they're done, we'll have a clear section for Q&A. Please raise anything that you want, either questions that you've pre-prepared or anything that's stimulated by the contributions that are made. If you want to ask a question, then as usual, just use the raise hand function at the bottom of your Zoom meeting, or if you'd rather not speak, then just put your question in the chat and I will pose it to our guests and we'll try and deal with it. If you're not speaking, then please stay muted, just because it's easier for everybody. And if you can, please keep your camera on, because it's so much better, particularly for our guests, when everybody can see each other's faces. the final thing from me, just a quick plug for our awards, which are taking place at the All England Club on the 26th of September. The nominations across the 11 categories close next week. So we'll drop a link to the awards in the chat, and just make sure that if you're thinking about making a submission, that you get it in before the deadline, and you can get your tickets as well on the same event page. We'll come back to that at the end if there's time. But for now, Chris, I offer you the floor.
Thanks so much, Tom. And thanks for inviting me along to speak today. I've got a few slides to speak about sustainability storytelling, and as Don mentioned, sort of the what people think. We've done a lot of work in the public with the public, and how to speak to different groups of the public in different segments, be that age, demographic, be that on specific topics, be background, location, loads of different stuff we've done over the last 20 years in the organisation. We've also done work not only just about understanding the audience when you're thinking about how to communicate sustainability and climate, but also about the qualities that you or I might have as a climate communicator as well, and how you might be able to stimulate those and make yourself a better communicator, or choose better communicators. So just to kick off with, let's go back to fundamentals, anthropology, things like that. Stories, that's how humans think. Humans are storytellers. They always have been, they always will be. You know, for real engagement, we want to be able to use that quality of humanness, that storytelling, you know, the way that we remember things, the way we act on them, the way that we feel things, has been proven time and time again. It's so much more visceral and better when it comes through a story and hearing a story. So if we're thinking about communicating anything, but especially things around sustainability and the environment, turning it into a story or finding those genuine stories and communicating them can do so much. But then, of course, you know, what kind of story do you tell and how do you tell it? There's millions, there's infinite amounts of stories that you can tell about climate change and sustainability. So we need to try and make a good story, choose a good story, and how we can present those. So over the last 20 years and before that, you know, there's been a lot of progress in what we do in terms of climate storytelling and climate communications and things. But there's still lots of lessons that that we've learned over that time and that we can still learn. And this is a real big one. You know, it used to be, climate change used to be the science story. It used to be about numbers. It used to be about graphs, and that, you still see that quite a lot. But we know more that it's about people's story. It's about communities. It's about impact on lives. And that's the best way to try and communicate things. You know, it used to be like parts per million, and now it's like parts of ourselves and parts of our communities that we need to be talking about. Moving away from kind of catastrophism and looking at like, oh, it's the end of the world and we can't do anything, the damage is done and everything's going to be terrible. That's not the kind of message that gets people moving forward and feeling positive about the future. So having, you know, these kind of images, they are shocking and they can get people to act, but the research shows that that kind of shock value can make you act over a short basis. But if you keep using this kind of thing, then people lose hope and they're not going to engage over the long term. So when it's better, we're talking about how we all play our part in what happens next, and how we can all help mitigate or adapt to the thing that's happening around us, and be part of a community, be that immediate or worldwide, that can move forward. Another one that comes up a lot is about education. People just don't understand, you know, if everyone knew what I knew, then they'd do what I do, that kind of thing. And we all know that's, you know, that's not going to work. But it needs to be more, people do care about climate, people care about sustainability, and giving them lots of information about, you know, what they could do. These are the 10 things that you should do, or these are the damages you're causing, and assuming that they're going to realize, oh, I've got to change my behavior, or I've got to support this, or I've got to be, you know, put my weight behind this. That's not how it works, because of people's lives and their different value sets. So we know people care. We know they're looking for leadership. We know they're looking for examples from others about how things are done. Another one is feeling really small. So people can feel really small when climate is, as we know, climate change and sustainability is a global problem. It's a massive problem. It's a massive issue. So people feel small. What can you really do to counteract that and counteract that hopelessness? It's showing what we're already doing. what we're already doing as individuals, what we're doing as communities, lots and lots of examples as organizations, as countries, and keep those positive things about, hey, people are doing things, and that maybe they're not always perfect, but people are doing things and making it forward, making progress forward, and trying to counteract that sort of doom mongering. It used to be that these green groups run action, and green groups obviously still around, conservation lobbyists and organizations and charities that are trying to raise awareness and things like that. They're still around, and they're still trying to convince people to make change, but it's not a niche issue anymore. It's not something that's just on a fringe desire of only a small group of people care about this. We know that most people want this action. Most people support this action to help with sustainability and climate. And examples from our own research, we've done our Britain Talks climate research we've been running in collaboration with More in Common and others since 2020, but we did a refresh in 2024, and this is stats from earlier this year, asking people if you think net zero is a good thing. So in the sample, which was representative of the UK, about 4,000 or 5,000 people, 62% said it was good, and only 10% thought net zero was bad news for the UK. So there's a big majority there that showed that they think net zero is a good thing. There's some undecided, but the people who think it's a bad thing, very few and far between. What does that look like? That's the whole picture, right? But what if we kind of break this down? So a lot of numbers and stuff on this graph, but just look at the orange bits, because that's where people think it's very good for the UK, or mostly good. And then from top to bottom, we've got lots of regions of England, and then also Scotland and Wales. And you'll see there that all the orange bars add up to over 50%. So regardless of region, we're seeing a majority support for net zero being a good thing. What about other things? It's not just region, it's age, it's living situation, and it's even by self-reported finances. These are all majorities. So you can see a trend there on finances on that one that's on the screen there. So people who are more comfortably off are more likely to think it's a good thing than people who are very well, not very well off at all. But even the groups there where it's the smallest out of everybody, it's still a majority that's saying that net zero is a good thing. So the majority of people in the UK think sustainability and climate is an important issue and things that should be done. When we asked in the same, this research was done in the run-up to the general election this year. So this is a general election themed question, but we asked for some sort of qualitative data here. So 1 or 2 words, describe how you would feel if a party pledged significant spending on climate and environmental initiatives in the lead up to the general election. And the overwhelming word that came through was happy, which was quite a surprise for us, because asking questions about manifestos and initiatives and things like that, and people saying happy doesn't come up that often. But 50% of people who responded to this in the sample wrote a positive word, a quarter was kind of neutral, and then a quarter was a negative word. But even then, this is beyond that term net zero and what people necessarily perceive net zero to be, which the other questions was about. This is more about spending on climate and environment as a whole, and there's really positive support for that as well in society. So that's kind of understanding the audience and thinking about the people you might want to speak to. The other thing I mentioned was kind of turning the mirror on yourself or ourselves as climate communicators and how we might be able to do that better. We did a big bit of research this year that we launched this year about trust and influence, and about being a better climate communicator, and how important trust is when you're speaking to your audience, and your audience trusting who they're hearing from. And of the vast amount of literature and research that's been done in this area, we kind of found these 3 areas that we could kind of operationalize and say, okay, this is something that people can actually use to be a better climate communicator. And it's these three elements: having empathy, passion, and credibility. So what are they? Passion, it's as a communicator, you're really caring about the issue and showing it, and you're clear on why you're talking about it. So why is this person talking to me about sustainability? You have to be very clear. I'm talking about it because I care, because it impacts me in this way, or it impacts the things that I care about, my values. Credibility. So this person knows what they're talking about and not just making it up on the spot. This doesn't mean you have to be a climate scientist in order to talk about climate, or know loads about technical details of solar panels or anything like this. But you need to be credible that what you're talking about and your experiences are credible to the person that you're speaking to as an organization or as an individual. And finally, empathy. So the person understands that people have different perspectives. I'm not being lectured or talked down to. That speaks to one of the things that I mentioned earlier about just assuming that telling someone what you think and they're gonna immediately listen to you. Showing that you understand that people are in different situations and you're not expecting them to do things that go against their values. You're just telling them honestly where you are coming from and that you understand that where they are as well. So finally, 3 short things to remember in terms of climate communication. Number 1, it's about being on the front foot, powerful and clear communication. So being proud and not apologetic, being proud of the sustainability actions that you, your organization or your business is doing. And people want to hear a big picture story that kind of excites them and reassures them, but they do also need detail. Otherwise, they might just think it's kind of greenwashing. Including everyone, we know that ideas can spread quickly between people, and not just from you to that person, it's going to spread between them. So including everybody, so people hear these messages from within the community as well as just from one single source, can mean things that can spread quicker, and those ideas become more prevalent within society. And finally, again, don't patronize people or write them off. People are grown-ups, people understand, are intelligent, they want more information. And an interesting thing, an important thing is that people might have major questions about what you're doing and why you're saying something. That doesn't mean that they're climate skeptics. I mean, if they're coming into a conversation, if you feel that they're coming into a conversation in without being good-natured, then you might think that they're climate skeptic or something, but most people just have questions about what you're doing and want to learn more. So being able to engage that and answer those really helps people bring along. Thanks very much. That's the end of my speech.
Chris, thank you very much. Before we come to Dave, I'm just going to invoke host privileges and do a couple of follow-ups, if that's all right. Do you know what? I was really struck actually by the slide that broke down kind of sentiment by region. And, you know, obviously you're saying like the positive sentiment like adds up in the kind of, you know, like really positive and then like somewhat positive adds up to over 50%. I was equally struck on that slide by how, how small, I think almost every line, the total for either kind of somewhat against or massively against was like less than 10%. And it reminds me of like years ago, we were working on some climate communication stuff for the Climate Coalition. And they put out an animation, which was like, even if climate change isn't a real thing, then by doing all of the things that we need to do to tackle climate change, all we end up with is cheaper energy, cleaner air, cleaner water, more jobs and more prosperous economy. So it's like an absolute kind of no-brainer on both sides. It really struck me actually. So the positive angle is there, but also the absence of the real strong negative is there. So you've got a fairly captive audience from the off. And then the other thing that struck me was, you know, that kind of triangle of qualities that you need to be a good communicator, an effective communicator on climate, like passion, empathy, and credibility. You know, think about a lot of the people on this call who, and you're meeting for the first time, Chris, and a lot of people throughout Basis membership exhibit those qualities. So we've got some ready-made communicators absolutely in this sector already, and I think it's a really good starting point. And I guess linked to that, my kind of question would be, you know, given the premise that this is about, like, you've proved with like verifiable data that like compelling stories based around people is the most effective way to communicate about climate change and sustainability, like taking that specifically into the sporting context, given that sport at its best is ultimately about like compelling stories that can really capture people's imagination. Like, do you think like sports are kind of just got a natural advantage from the off when trying to tell these stories?
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, the stories are best told, you know, when you if you're telling a story about a friend, you know, you tell a story about a friend to somebody else, they know who that friend is. They've already got all this knowledge that already exists about who you're talking about. You know, here we've got sports, we've got clubs and organizations who are already speaking to people who know them as a club, who have great history and heritage about a club or about a sport, or the life that they might have had playing that sport themselves for in whatever way. And there's already all of that connection with the pastime or the organization that's really rich and can help contextualize. You know, it's really easy to come up with great stories about a club or about an organization or about somebody who's taking part in sport, because they've already got all that context around it that's really rich and ready for storytelling.
Yeah. It really seems to be that way. And just thinking about, like, obviously a lot of BASIS members are kind of various different stages of their sustainability journeys, if you like. And some are, you know, out there talking about it all the time and have got an established way of communicating about it. And some are thinking about, you know, how we're going to, like, you know, they've just developed a strategy and thinking how they might start to communicate that to their audiences. And you quite often find with any area of public debate that, you know, the strongest views are at the two extremes. So totally get the point about, you know, the vast majority of the public is supportive, but there's going to be an element of the public which isn't supportive, and potentially an element of, you know, individual organizations that are represented on this call, their audiences, you know, representing those extremes of views. And sometimes, you know, you might be in a situation where when you start to communicate about this externally, like the 2 or 3, you know, on social media, for example, the 2 or 3 kind of first responses that you get are kind of a little bit hostile because they represent one of those extremes. Like, what advice would you give to an organization to be able to kind of set that to one side and to remain confident in communicating about this stuff, remain confident that that audience is there? Like, is that, you know, is that something you've come across with organizations you've worked with in the past and been able to help them navigate?
Yeah, I'm gonna show empathy here from the triangle and say that it's a really, really tough problem. It is tough because it's about having that confidence to look past that. But I mean, organizations, you're doing, you know, individuals and organizations, you're doing this sustainability work. You're doing it because you believe it's the right thing to do and it's a good thing to do. So that's something that you've always got to come back to and say, this is the, you know, we think we're doing the right thing in the best possible way that we can. Like you mentioned at the top, you know, caveats of not everybody can do everything. So you're just doing you're doing a certain things that's within the capabilities of the organization or as an individual. So you've got to have confidence that you're doing that, and you've got to just keep going. And you keep putting out there those positive things. I mean, there's the bad faith arguments that our advice would be to not really engage with those, not try and come up with counter information to what bad faith actors or someone you perceive as a bad faith actor might be putting forward to you, because the more you repeat those climate falsehoods and things like that, the more they get out there anyway and remain prevalent within society. So counteracting, if you need to, just with more positive content and just keep plugging away, showing what you're doing, and eventually you've got the confidence is that those people who are not the first commenters will start to feed back, and you'll hear from them that they really appreciate the sustainable messaging. Or you can go out and find out from those people that you know your followers who aren't those first people responding.
Yeah, thank you. And the thought just struck me that quite a few of our members who've put out sustainability strategies recently have, like, you know, engaged with fans, you know, athletes, key partners or whatever in advance. So it's, you know, actually that kind of, I guess, the mandate to take action is demonstrated in the strategy, that it comes from within the sport. So, you know, I guess it's a good way to sort of navigate that from the off. Chris, thank you. I think we'll say thank you for now, but I'm fairly sure that people will have some questions for you. So we'll be re-pinning you to the screen towards the end. But now I'm going to pin Dave, if that's all right. And Dave, I'm just going to start by asking you, if you don't mind, just to remind people who you are and what you do, and also like how you ended up in this role, because it's quite interesting, like the journey from, you know, sports news producer to, you know, editorial sustainability lead.
Yeah, thanks, Dom, for the opportunity to talk to everyone and for everyone joining, you know, in giving their time. I think it is interesting, how my role came about and how I sort of entered into this, because as you've acknowledged, sort of everyone's on a journey here, everyone's at different stages of that journey, and BBC have been on a bit of a journey with this, and perhaps even more so BBC Sport. We were doing nothing. We were doing more behind the scenes than we were doing for our audiences for a long time, for maybe 4 or 5 years. And as a journalist and producer who was mainly working in those social aspects of sport and those political aspects of sport, doing stories about inclusion, about race, about integrity, about, you know, doping and all those sorts of things, and you know, even the discussion around human rights and trans inclusion in sport. It just struck me quite a long time ago that we weren't having the same conversations around the environment and around sustainability, and we were doing stuff behind the scenes. Not much, I'll acknowledge, but we weren't trying to pursue the agenda for our audiences and bring stuff to our audiences. And I think that became, you know, in my mind, increasingly unsustainable, pardon the pun, once the penny dropped with me, in part thanks to people like yourself, Dom, and Russell, who's on the call, and others, but to the extent at which sport, this is existential for sport, and sport does not exist without, you know, clean water, clean air, you know, a healthy environment, you know, athletes need nutrition. There are so many links, and so it almost became a, you know, a no-brainer. But what I think people perhaps don't, or sort of acknowledge, or perhaps understand, is that it did take quite a long time to get, you know, BBC Sport into a position where they felt confident, you know, publishing these stories and investing in these stories. And it was a journey, and it was a journey to the point where eventually, yeah, they kind of created this role for me that kind of sits across. And it's interesting also, I think, you know, your audience, or our audience here today, come from lots of different types of organizations. There might be people who are associated with associations or federations, who are associated with venues or clubs, and so I think that, you know, they're all at different stages of their journey. They've all got different things that they want to achieve through their storytelling. And that question of engaging the communications people in your teams, that question of whether, you know, you as sustainability professionals can be involved in that conversation. I sort of was the other way around. I kind of came at it. I was the communication person. I was the editorial person. I was the journalistic person who kind of had to skill up and try and do a bit of learning to give me credibility and give me the knowledge that I need in the sustainability field. And I actually don't think it matters whichever way you come at it. And I actually think for your communications departments, if they are reluctant to roll their sleeves up and sort of engage in this, then there's an opportunity for you there, or for someone there. I know we're all kind of probably overworked, and it's very hard to take on this extra burden, but I do not see why it has to be, you know, a communications expert that sits and gets involved in the storytelling externally. So that's kind of, I think that there are parallels in the way that we've approached it that could be relevant to some people on the call. Just to move on and sort of, yeah, talk to the subject at hand. I think one of the things, I mean, I pick up on what you said, Dom, about it being divisive in society, and I think that there has been division around some of these things. I think we have to remember the areas where there isn't division, and I think especially in this country, but in the wider world, you know, we can appeal to people through stories of social justice and climate justice. I think that human interest element is something that a lot of audiences and fans can relate to. I think nature is something that brings people together, particularly in this country. A lot of nature, you can talk to people through that. There are ways you can tell these stories and ways you can get involved in the conversation, and bringing it away from that divisive area. And the one, just nodding to what I said earlier, the one thing that is not divisive perhaps for all of us is that this is existential to most sports. There's another thing that unites most of us, I think, here on this conversation, and most of the organizations, is that we care about the future of sport, but we care about the future of our own organizations as well. And BBC is no different, is absolutely obsessed with younger audiences and with engaging younger people. And so sustainability, environmental awareness is a really good opportunity. You can be cynical about it, as many of my colleagues are, and think, oh yeah, you know, we'll get the young people on side by sort of doing more of these stories. But picking up on something that Chris said, being on the front foot, I think actually there's a real sort of like corporate reason for here to sort of invest in the future of your organization, to get on the front foot and to show that you are a leader in this area, or that you're doing stuff in this area, and not to look to reap any rewards from that in the cycle of one news cycle around any one story, but to look to serve your audiences, whoever there is you're trying to reach through the stories you have to tell, and through that serve the future of your sport. And it's also important to remember, I'm sure for a lot of you, that who is that audience you're talking to? So quite often when we do stories at BBC, we're kind of constantly mindful of the fact we're talking to fans and we're talking to our audiences, but then you look at it a slightly different way. And I'm sure in your case, even more so, you're talking to participants, you're talking to families, you're talking to people who play sport. And so the message can be sort of, you know, more diverse, and you can tell stories in different ways to appeal to different segments of your audience. And I think especially in that notion of participants and sort of relating to them. What do BBC want? We you know, what are we looking for? There's two things here. So I think I don't have any slides, unfortunately, so you're just gonna have to stare at my face and listen to me rabbit on. But essentially BBC split our sort of our coverage in this area into three areas. It's inspiring, informing, and investigating. Now, the investigating I'm going to leave to one side, because that's kind of our journalism, and you know, that's kind of us holding to account organizations that we don't think are honoring their commitments. And we kind of do that as a public service duty. And there are other media organizations who don't devote as much time or attention to that for whatever reason. But we do think in the BBC that gives us more credibility when we say to our audiences, oh, but look at what this organization are doing. Look at this, you know, great bit of ingenuity or this team that are doing this sort of thing. So it gives that sort of, I suppose, that credibility. And then in the inspiring section, it's kind of like engaging the athletes. And that is a challenge. And that is when you are offering stories to media organizations, there are kind of a couple of shortcuts. One is athletes. I think, you know, I've said this to many of you countless times. It is the athletes who sort of drive a lot of engagement. And so to hear from them, I suppose the other shortcut to getting interest from journalists and from media organizations is to have something unique and to have a USP. I think, you know, fortunately, we're in a world now where the publication of a sustainability strategy with net zero targets and all that goes along with it, waste reduction targets, what have you, is not that interesting to a journalist or to a media organization, because, you know, thankfully, a lot of that is happening. However, if in what you are doing in your strategy, you think you have something that other organizations aren't doing, that is kind of unique, or, you know, hasn't, maybe other organizations are doing it, but they haven't told the story of it, then that, I think, is something that will interest media organizations and the likes of myself. I think that gets harder, obviously, to keep trying to find unique, you know, angles on these stories is a little bit of a you know, it gets harder over time, because, you know, more and more things get done. I'd sort of pull out a couple of examples from recent times. One that we did around the BASIS conference, actually, and the Clean Water Alliance, and obviously that was a story that had already got a huge amount of media attention. But one of the things that a lot of my editors were really keen on that story for, because it showed collaboration and it showed organizations coming together, and I think that sort of was a good example to set for everyone in this space. We know that none of us can solve this problem on our own, the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis. We need to work together. So I think just the pure fact that that was a collaboration was really of interest to bosses. And then the other thing is around that having that integrity to the messaging. And yes, that needs to come from the top level. And that needs to come from having integrity in your policies, in the structures of your organization. But it can also come from the storytelling itself as well. And so I'll embarrass Hattie and call her out, but like that Wimbledon did a lot of stuff this time round with their media provider Whisper. And one of the things they did was correct me if I get any of this wrong, Hattie, but that you did the almost like the poem, you know, people reading inspiring lines, you know, trying to deliver a little bit of a call for action. The interesting thing about that is it not necessarily that it was in its any way unique, but it was showing that you're prepared to invest time and money in this, not just to promote what you are doing, but to do, you know, a companion message. And so, you know, if all that an organization does is put out releases and put out content and put out stuff when they've got something to say, when they've got something they want to shout about, that kind of can undermine that message. And it becomes like a, you know, a PR exercise. If the organization can be involved in that conversation in other ways, either in the one part of the year where that organization hosts an event or whatever, or even throughout the year, and going back to collaboration, if through your communication channels and your media channels, you can champion what others are doing, you can have that dialogue that exists around your big moments that you want to publicize. So that triangle we were talking about, as well as, you know, empathy and credibility, passion, I'd add in sort of integrity and honesty into that mix. And I think that the people on this call, you know, that's what you bring to the table. That's what you can almost hold the hands of your communications people through this potentially, or maybe point out to them that they need to sort of like get better more across the conversations in this area, just in the way they might, you know, other really important, you know, narratives within sport. You would expect communications people to be across those, because this narrative isn't going away. It's only going to get more pronounced, and we're going to have to be more creative in ways to tell it and ways to engage people in it. And so I think that, you know, in the same way that, as I say, BBC Sport was on a journey, I think that there is an opportunity for us all here to sort of go and like rattle the cages of those who aren't, you know, who are the blockers to our sort of pursuing better stories. I could sort of go on, but I'll leave it there because I'm conscious of time. And I think also because of the range of people on this call, I think it might actually be more interesting to get some questions and specific examples and stuff.
Dave, thank you. I have a couple of follow-ups, but I do want to open the floor. And actually, I'm really glad that you highlighted the work that Hattie and Wimbledon have done this year, because I was going to do the same thing. Hattie, I'm so tempted to just put you on the spot and unmute you and get you to talk about it. If you want to, I would love for you to, yeah, is that a nod? Just a quick introduction of what you've done, and then we'll share some links because it's really beautiful.
Now, or did you want to do your...
Oh, why not? Yeah. Why not? Yeah, let's go.
So, hi everyone, and Dave, thanks for mentioning that video. And what I would say is I would not take any personal credit for it. I give credit to actually a lady called Georgie Green, who's our head of broadcast production, who is a real champion for environment and sustainability, and very much sort of put into the working clauses with Whisper, who we work with. Again, somebody on the broadcast side will be able to say more. We do our own broadcast feed, but Whisper do all sorts of content alongside that, and they work with lots of different sports organizations. But she just said to them, we want some sustainability and environment content this year. So they did a whole load of it. But that player poem, which again, I totally agree, Dave, and that was something that we wanted to do, was absolutely not talking about Wimbledon. It was talking about the bigger picture. And again, what's a really nice feature to it, I think, it may have been a happy coincidence, but that it's a series of headshots of of competitors at Wimbledon. So some big, you know, some Iga Swiatek, for example, who was the #1 seed, some big names on there, but also interspersed with members of staff from Wimbledon as well. So people from the grounds team. So it was, I thought that was really lovely, and it's nice and short, and they're just looking straight down the lens, talking about how important it is to protect the environment and but relating it to sport as well. You know, to succeed, it will be the match of our lives. So having a kind of sporting theme to it. Whisper did it, they were brilliant in terms of getting the players, you know, and we may have had Wimbledon staff because we couldn't get enough players, I don't know, but I think that was a, you know, it worked really well. To get the player participation is just about building the relationships and also building it into their required commitments when they're there, as sort of professional athletes. So again, I don't quite know how we pulled it off, but you know, Whisper, our broadcast team, did it. We also got some other content. We did something involving the players in kind of nature and biodiversity around the grounds. So obviously for us, we're really lucky with our, you know, our aim to have a positive impact on the environment, and positioning ourselves as tennis in an English garden really helps with that. So we got the players decorating bug hotels and talking about how, you know, time in nature is a sort of helpful thing for their own mental health and, you know, physical health as well. We did a quickfire quiz in the queue, which was anything from how many times has Serena Williams won Wimbledon to what's your favorite tree, what's your favorite insect, how many how many bottles do we save by introducing the reusable bottle scheme, and that was a sort of fun thing. And it was just had the support of our social team this time, which in past has been challenging, because I think it's kind of sustainability doesn't necessarily perform so well. It doesn't perform as well as Carlos Alcaraz hitting an amazing shot. But I think we've got to the feeling now where it's something that is part of who we are as an organization, and it is a message equally that we want to get across.
Thanks, Hattie, and thanks for jumping in when being put on the spot. We'll get some links shared either in the chat or in follow-up, because honestly, it's worth a few minutes of everybody's time. And actually, the one with the players, and then also kind of Wimbledon staff, like that came across as like a real leveler. So actually, I think really enhanced like the whole feel of the video. I noticed that Jacob from Street Games had a hand up. Jacob, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, please, Dom. Hi, everyone. For those that have not met me before, apologies, I'm out and about at the moment, which is why my camera's off. I'm on a phone dialing in. But I had a question. So for anyone that doesn't know, Street Games uses the power of sport to help disadvantaged young people and underserved communities. And both speakers today have like pricked up my ears, because whenever I come on these basis calls, I don't normally hear the word young people, and I don't normally hear the word communities. And both speakers today have kind of brought those two words up. So it's brilliant that that's been the case. My question is, for the kind of the BBC and the storytelling side of things, I've been working on Street Games sustainability kind of journey for about a year now. Been part of Basis for a couple of conferences. That's been amazing. And I'm now trying to access the kind of network of what we call locally trusted organizations, which Street Games probably has about 2,000 across the United Kingdom. These locally trusted organizations run your classic Friday night community sport, what we call doorstep sport. And I was really interested how the BBC, and I want to access those networks and talk to them about how they can be environmentally sustainable, and how Street Games can support them, and how Street Games can represent them to organisations like Basis and Sport England. So then from a BBC point of view, how would we tell that story of an organisation like that on the level of when there's like potentially Wimbledon in the room? It's like kind of apples and pears, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting one, and but also that's why I was keen to sort of like mention the word participation and mention, you know, and it is a battle. It's a, you know, ultimately our website, you know, it has to perform, it has to, you know, to get the clicks and to get the attention, and the elite sport is often the way and the shorthand and the easiest, pathway to do that. But BBC is a public service organisation, and we have in the past had Get Inspired, which you're probably familiar with. And the reason we left Get Inspired behind was because we kind of decided to think that was up to individual sports within our BBC sport organisation. So our football team, it's their job to engage with football's grassroots and to engage with those smaller, organisations. I think the question is, have we been successful in that? And that's open for debate. In answer to your specific question, how do you engage them? And I would say this to Wimbledon as much as I say this to you. I think it's, for me, we quite often like hearing as many stories as possible, and we might not be able to tell any one story at any one given moment. But if you get in touch and you let us know of, if you're representing thousands of grassroots organizations and participation organizations, you've probably got a plethora of what I mentioned as those USPs, those unique things that those people are doing. If you get in touch and, are able to tell us 10, 12, 15 of them, then it may be that we can't do anything about any one of those stories, because we're probably not going to put a small Friday night football club on the front page of the BBC Sport website. However, you can sow a seed in my mind or a colleague's mind, that when we come to cover an issue, it might be, oh, well, we've got an example here. We've got a grassroots example, because most of the time we talk about sustainability and talk about issues, the mindset of myself and other journalists that I'm trying to sort of engender is that we cover it from both angles. We do want the views of the Premier League. We do want to reflect what goes on in the Premier League, but yeah, we want to talk about the participants and that sort of thing. And so maybe, you can either just come forward and say, this is going on, that's going on, this is going on, or you can pitch that story in the knowledge that it's not going to get on its own, but you could make that next leap on behalf of us. You could say, we've got this great little club doing this great little thing. This could be part of a wider feature looking at blah, blah, blah. And I think it's finding, that's one of the creative ways we try to use to tell more stories. So that would be one little tip. There's probably others, but yeah, that would be the one that springs to mind.
The last thing I'd mention on that, sorry if I'm taking up too much time as well, Dom, but like I've had kind of similar conversations with those organizations at events that Street Games might put on. And the kind of first thing they'll come back to me, they'll be like, Jacob, I can't keep the lights on. I'm struggling to keep the lights on. I can't focus on sustainability just yet. Like, I'm really interested in your passion for it and what you're doing with Street Games. And we've seen the comms post, we've seen your strategy. We know you're doing work with Sport England on action plans, but like, I'm struggling to keep the lights on. I've got bigger fish to fry than sustainability. I don't want to offend anyone on the call, because obviously it's all part of our kind of jobs. But yeah, that's my kind of follow-up question, is how do I communicate to an organisation that can't keep their lights on and pay the bills at the end of the month?
Well, that's possibly the best story you've got, is the fact that if you can get 5 or 6 organisations that can't keep the lights on and can't afford to be sustainable, then what I talked about earlier with BBC Sport having this obligation to hold to account, that's holding to account the wider sports industry, not any one part. It's like saying, like, how can we let our, and grassroots are going to face more of these challenges. Basis have done their own research, Sport England have done their own research. The burden is going to fall increasingly on grassroots sport. So I think there's a story there in and of its own right. Whether I can't commit to telling it now, but it's constantly thinking, okay, well, how do we surface this? How do we tell this? And what is the story here? So I think there is something potentially in that. It might not help, but I would say, fits into that third category of that sort of investigation, of kind of telling the story beneath the story, which perhaps not everyone hears or sees.
Amazing.
Thanks, Jacob. Thanks, Dave, for the responses. And Jacob, just we will absolutely take on that challenge at the start as well about not hearing enough about young people and communities on these calls. So let's get our heads together about how we can put something on that speaks to that over the next few months. Floor's open for another 7 minutes. So if anybody's got a question, then please raise your hand. I'm just going to check the chat because I've just seen something come in. And actually, yeah, Jamie, just a comment there from James from World Rugby about how you know, it'd be good we can demonstrate that sustainability can actually enable us to keep the lights on more effectively, because over the long term, the payback period is absolutely going to be there. But I think, Jacob, there is a really important issue there about kind of the upfront cost in terms of money and bandwidth for organisations that are really on the edge, and how we can properly provide the support. Chris, you've got your hand up. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks. I was just going to, I guess, have a comment on what Jacob was talking about. There's also, you know, in terms of storytelling, there's reactions or responses that grassroots sports people have in you know, to climate change events. So we all know about extreme weather. We all know about heat and flooding of areas. You know, people are out there dealing with those things now, and dealing with them in very positive, can-do ways. Their stories as well. You know, if your football pitch is flooded and you have to sort out how you're going to still get the how you're going to sort that out, or make sure that it doesn't next time, or reschedule things, or make sure people can still do things. That's really positive stories about people coming together in the face of climate action and raising that profile as well. And they're really positive stories that I think the wider the wider country needs to hear.
Yeah, thanks. I think we've been going for like 55 minutes. I feel like we're just getting warmed up now, and could go all afternoon. Rachel, you've got your hand up. Please go ahead.
Oh yeah, thank you. I'm not from comms background per se, but as you're saying that we've been kind of helping through British Rowing do our bit. But it was just a couple of observations really, that sort of through partnership and collaborations is how we managed to kind of seem to have got cut through, and I'm constantly amazed about how it seems to be working. So obviously we're part of the Clean Water Sports Alliance, and I can see Kate here from the RYA too. And that you mentioned, you know, I was amazed at the kind of take up of that when we launched back in April. Happened to be during the conference, and surprised. But it's interesting to say that here that was through collaboration. I just whizzed a note to everybody to tell them about that. So that's really kind of interesting to hear, and good, because my experience so far, and I'm kind of learning on the job really, is that it's through collaboration that we're managing to do anything and everything. And the other thing is that through another collaboration is with River Action, and just observing what that is doing is quite interesting, because it's easy to be quite cynical, I think, about oh, can you carry on and on and on about kind of similar issue, but it is carrying on and on and on, and from what I'm observing, it seems to be moving the dial faster than it might otherwise move on this issue, which is of course of clean or more like dirty water. So it's a kind of power of the media, and being fairly kind of new to this, as I said, it's just I'm being constantly pleasantly surprised about how you can get cut through and what it is doing in kind of real terms. Kate, I don't know, I can see you on camera. I don't know if you want to come in on that. But so thank you. And yeah, interesting to say that you're interesting to hear what it makes it interesting from your point of view, and then what it's doing in the kind of wider sphere.
Thanks, Rachel. I think that really comes across actually in what you're talking about there in the British Rowing strategy, because it's like, right, we care about the sport, and obviously sport takes place on rivers, but we care about the health of every river, even if people don't row on it, and all of the indicators are that the health is not good and declining. And then taking the step to work with all other water-based sports to form that coalition, and having that coalition then, and you know, using the platform of the conference enabled you then to, you know, get national broadcast coverage, which ran all day, and which continues to, you know, to generate further coverage. Absolutely fantastic. And the sequencing in that messaging is really natural, but also seems to be really powerful.
Now, if I can just add on one thing on that, the collaboration was of interest as well, but that what I also wanted to, or should say on that, as well as when we did Sport England stuff about grassroots, they were both human stories that for especially for our news colleagues, which BBC Sports provide news, sports news to news. They were really interested in how those stories affected families, affected kids, affected Sunday mornings, affected the ability to you know, and actually this the increase in waterlogged pitches in the cricket calendar and that sort of thing. the most powerful interviews we did on that subject were not with Chris Boardman. They were with parents who are saying, I'm worried about my kids, you know, sitting on screens when they should be out playing, you know, playing cricket, because the pitch is waterlogged, because the, you know, the rain, and we haven't had 7 games. We've had 7 games postponed. So again, it's making the story human as well, and making it of interest.
Brilliant. I think that's like obviously the central message that's come out of this session, and I can't believe it, but we're already out of time. So I want to say a big thank you to Chris for joining us and for putting the work in advance to prepare that presentation. Jacob, you asked in the chat whether those slides would be available, and with Chris's permission, we will circulate them. But also, I do encourage everybody to go to the Climate Outreach website, because they've got loads and loads of similar resources, which are absolutely brilliant and all freely available. So we'll send a general link round as well in follow-up. Dave, I want to thank you as well for joining us and for sharing your insight from your absolutely unique position within, you know, the country's biggest broadcaster. And also just to thank you for all the work that you've done over the years. Like, if there has ever been a sustainability in sports story that's been on any BBC channel, then the overwhelming likelihood is that it's come across Dave's desk, and he's been, you know, in large part responsible for getting it out there. So I think on behalf of BASIS and the whole sector, like, we offer you a huge amount of thanks for the work that you've done and continue to do. And I think all of us can, you know, go away motivated to try and give you more stories and more angles, so you can get more of these stories out there across the BBC channels.